Uh, Thank you, Dr. Faruqi, for your very nice presentation. I just have one question regarding literature, particularly in the vernacular Urdu.
Hmm.
We witnessed that during the progressive writers movement, the Taraqi Pasand Urdu
Tahriq.
Tehreek.
Hmm.
Yeah, so the writers were writing, and was it that they were trying to create a new kind of world? And after the advent of postmodernism and, in a certain sense, a triumph of capitalism, that we don't witness that kind of in Urdu. That's the Miyari adab,
Hmm.
or the adab that basically has some message to it. Did postmodernism change that kind of thinking? And also, particularly because I belong to a conflict region of Kashmir. In Kashmir, also, there are many writers in Urdu, vernacular Urdu, and Kashmiri writing, but nobody has documented the nuances of the conflict, like we witness the conflict literature coming from Palestine and Ireland and other such places. The Kashmiri literature, particularly in the vernacular Urdu and Kashmiri, is very rare. Is it because the state is so much strong, or that utopia, or what the intellectuals and writers are supposed as a responsibility to write? Have they just given up that kind of thing? So these were my two questions.
Okay, thank you, Mushtaq. I'll request you to just repeat the first question. You asked about vernacular literature, that the progressive writers were trying to create a new trend,
Yes,
uh, and then you talked about postmodernism.
postmodernism. Then
Yeah.
postmodern, did it change that that there is no meaning, everything is
Okay.
subjective, and we don't, because also there was demise of communism in a certain sense, and
Yes.
and
So you
and
were
all.
essentially asking this
Yes,
question related to Mayari Adab, right?
yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, great. I'll be quick. Again, I mean, I think these are, you see, these are questions that are very, uh, that are straight out of our, our lived experiences. And these are deep concerns and inquiries. But of course, as far as the formalities go, I'll try and address these questions. So in relation to Urusa's question, yes, I'm grateful to you for checking me in my tracks, as it were. But of course, on the one hand, I do agree with you that back in the day when I was in JNU, things were very different. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that has happened. There is, in true sense, quote unquote, an awakening that has happened. And there's no denying that position. I think you're absolutely right that things have changed and changed substantially, significantly. And there's a certain kind of identity politics, a very, very, very dynamic, fruitful, and democratically charged identity politics and identity informed assertion that we see now in JNU politics. There is fraternity movement. There are other factions here and there that are trying to constantly, at least round the year. Of course, during the election, the things are a little different, but round the year they're trying to contest the hegemonic position of the left across campus politics spectrum. But I would say that while there is a certain truth in your assertion, I would still want to point out that, you know, I mean, even if you don't call it a bubble, or even if you don't say that there is a certain kind of false consciousness that kind of grips or captivates the imagination of JNU students or JNU community, I would nonetheless want to point out that, I mean, think about, because you talked about it, think about the night, JNU students were attacked, right? So you have these goons entering from all sides of the campus. And of course, there was a message that was circulated, and we rushed, and so many, friends from even SAU, a lot of people were there. I met a few students there, colleagues from SAU, one or two, of course. uh, so people essentially ran from, so somebody came from CR Park. There were few people who had come from Jaipur to Delhi. They got to know, they came. There were few who had come from, and they were not even students of JNU. They just came in solidarity. But when I was standing there, one thing that I was thinking repeatedly, and it was a very scary moment, by the way. In the beginning, people were not, because my sister-in-law was there, and she was almost surrounded by, goons. and she had to be rescued by an NDTV journalist also got beaten. So it was a bit scary in the beginning, and people were not really right outside the North Gate. They were in front of the Paschimabad Gate, and from there they actually walked all the way to the North Gate. So all of us walked. Now, one thing that I was thinking throughout that night, we were there till 4 in the morning. One thing that I was thinking again and again was that not even a single individual from Munirka came. Now, Munirka is across the North Gate, right? So there has to be, I mean, I'm not saying that, I mean, I don't know. I just fail to understand that, you know, people from Okhla are coming, people from Aligarh have come, people from CR Park, Shadra, you know, ITO, Old Delhi, even many anti-CA protesters also came because JNU played a very, very important role in that entire agitation. People were coming from all nooks and corners of the city. And eventually it was a huge gathering around 2 o'clock in the morning, roughly about, you know, 3,000 people across. But not even, you know, few from Munirka. I mean, even if there were people from Munirka, these were JNU students, ex-JNU students. Let's be very clear about it. So I think while a lot of new developments have happened inside the campus, my concern is, and I think our concern should be, that this did not really find an audience outside, immediately outside the campus. This, I suppose, is something that the JNU community, of course, I will also have to think about it. I can't really absolve myself of that. I think that there is something missing in our activism, because if we are getting beaten up badly by goons, and if we can't get immediate, I mean, people from immediate neighborhood, then I think something has happened, right? Something is missing. So this is something that I wanted to, I mean, this is something that I still think about. While I completely agree with you that it need not be considered a utopia of the kind that it was back in the day when I was there as a student. But I would nonetheless want to pitch this, that there's still something that's missing, that dynamic politics, although ridiculously extraordinary, but has somehow again failed to find an audience outside, right? So students are still running, they're still running for their lives, etc. And that's very unfortunate that we don't have, you know, I mean, for instance, if, I mean, I don't know, when Jamia was happening, you know, exactly something of that sort didn't happen, but as a result of police high-handedness, you know, a lot of people from Jamia Nagar, so Jamia has a very different relationship with Jamia Nagar as a result of cultural historical reasons. But I suppose here and there, I think we can think about why JNU failed to make that connection. In relation to the burden of association, I think it's a very important question. I think there's been a certain, I mean, I've been trying to clarify again and again. I didn't mean to, and I think it will be a sin on my part, a reprehensible crime, to say that those who are marginalized need to dissociate themselves from their identity. Of course not. As I was saying earlier to this friend from Kerala who was asking the question earlier, that in fact, democracy wants me to claim my identity as a Muslim, as a Dalit, as a woman, right? As a Kashmiri, for that matter. Now, so the burden of association is on those who are privileged. Who gets, I mean, Dalits would always want to associate themselves with the Brahmins. Where is the problem? The problem lies with the Brahmins, right? So the marginalized would always want to, you know, extend a hand. I don't think marginalized are hell-bent upon, a reversal of fascism. Not at all. The marginalized are always willing to sort of, you know, take a step forward. But it is the not so marginalized, it's the privileged who will always have issues with coming forward, with going beyond. So the dissociation is expected from those who are privileged, not the marginalized. Democracy is expecting the Brahmin to do away with his privileges, to think beyond his Brahmanical identity. Democracy wants the privileged majoritarian community, majority community, because if, and the simple example is, if the majority community does not think above itself, you cannot rescue Indian democracy. Indian democracy is done and dusted. We cannot do anything about Indian democracy. It is the majority community that will have to think above its immediate identity. And only then can everything, shady that's carried out in the name of democracy can be checked in its tracks. So we are not supposed to dissociate ourselves from identities. They happen to be our reservoir. They are our source of conviction, right? So a Dalit is not required to do away with his Dalit identity, her Dalit identity. A woman, a Kashmiri, a Muslim, a person from the Northeast, a person from a tribal background, etc., etc. So the burden of association is, or let's say the responsibility, I'm also not phrasing it a certain way, the responsibility lies on those who are powerful in terms of numbers, right? So those who are majority, those who sort of call the shots, as it were, the privileged, the elite, the not gifted, sorry, the haves, as it were. So these are the people on whom lies the responsibility of coming up with this, initiating what Ambedkar called an associated mode of living, right? So this is something. So I'm once again making it very clear that I did not mean to say. In fact, I think I did say this, although I don't exactly recollect, but I did say this, that I don't mean to say that marginalized identities need to do away with their identity claims. In relation to Mushtaq's question, I mean, I would say that I mean, there are various ways in which postmodernism has been looked at from scholars working on literature. And Urdu literature, of course, has a very different. I mean, it was a little late in responding, but people like Shamsur Rahman Faruqi, Gopi Chand Narag, and others have responded to this whole development. Uh, See, one thing that is very clear is, although postmodernism is a fairly, it's a very cool thing, and people take pride in, citing Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and who not. But one thing that postmodernism refuses to acknowledge is that as human beings, we always need uh, a certain, what should I say, a certain basis of our existence, right? There's a wonderful book by Zygmunt Bauman. It's called Intimations of Postmodernity. And in that, Bauman has actually critiqued, in a certain sense, the postmodern assertion that there are no grand narratives, that there is no universal truth. What Bauman is essentially pointing out is that, and I think in the case of literature as well, this is something that is important, that this multiplicity can be expressed, but you will always operate from a certain position. The subject position cannot be denied its due. For instance, to go back to Urusa's question, identity politics stands in the face of postmodernism. If you look at Edward Said's issues with postmodernism, one thing that Edward Said was repeatedly insisting on, and people like Foucault and others could not respond to that, was how do you look at the whole identity politics question? For instance, Foucault could not respond to Palestinian liberation movement. I mean, how does a postmodern thinker or a postmodernist reflect on these extraordinary moments of identity informed assertions, right? Whether it's the mosque movement or it's the Palestinian liberation movement or it's the Kashmir movement or any tribal assertion. So identities are important. So there is a certain corpus that we always want to hold on to. Now, at times, as a result of politics of knowledge and episteme, it could become a meta grand narrative. But for the most part, these remain, multiple. I mean, these remain contesting narratives. So in the case of literature as well, I mean, postmodernism did bring in a certain things a little later, of course. So, for instance, questions related to multiplicity of experience, questions related to diasporic experience. These were things that were brought in Urdu literature. In fact, people like Quratullah and Haider, sorry, not Quratullah and Haider, people like Ismat Choktai also at some point in time started writing about, a woman who's actually settled abroad. So womanhood or gendered experience was also looked at from the vantage point of diaspora, migration, etc. So postmodernism did bring in a certain shift, but I think it was a phenomenal shift because I think modernism, the claimants of modernism, Jadidiyat, the icon, of course, is Shamsur Rahman Faruqi. I think that proposition remains more powerful in the context of Urdu literature of the times we live in. Lastly, in relation to Kashmir, I mean, when you talked about the literature in Kashmir, of course, I am as ignorant as a stone when it comes to this. But given what you said, I would say that literature always has a certain degree of self-censorship, and particularly literature of marginality. So usually there is self-censorship, and once in a while there is a disguised expression as well. So only someone who is raised in Kashmir might be able to read between the lines. If I were to read in translation, I might not get it. But there are ways in which expressions of marginality find their way in literary texts. So of course, on the face of it, it might be a simple story. I'm just sort of, as it were, these are shots in the air, but on the face of it, it might be a simple narrative, very sequential and adhering to the linear sequence of time, etc. But maybe those who are aware of the Kashmiri experience might be able to read it somewhere. And it might also be the case that my mother is able to read between the lines more than I'm able to, although I'm trained in reading and whatnot. I've done courses on reading, writing, and whatever, thinking. But my mother, because there is a certain nuance that's there as a result of few words here and there, that she's able to get, right? There is an exchange. But in general, literatures also indulge in self-censorship. Adorno famously wrote, when he was talking about when he was contributing to Marxist literary criticism, one thing that he said was that as critics we should not be interested in what the literature says or what the text says, but what the text hides. So actually, this brings me to the final point, that the fact that they are not writing about it itself is an expression. And it's a phenomenal expression. It's almost like a blank editorial, right? At the time of emergency, remember Statesman, blank page. And recently, I think some Hindi daily or some Rajasthan daily also carried out a blank page as a result of the high-handedness of the regime. So, so because I'm not writing about it, that also tells that you have reached or you have subjugated me to the extent that I don't even feel like writing about the subjugation. Now, that's a completely different chapter, or a completely different expression of a violent suffering, right? So when people, so for instance, when we talk about silent mothers, right? So I mean, our mothers hardly speak about what they go through. This is the epitome of violence or suffering. So this is another thing that I can think of. But of course, because I'm not from the valley, these are just preliminary remarks, and I mean, I'm willing to be humbled by being told that this is not the right diagnosis. But this is usually the way in which literature of marginality or literature reflective on suffering works. That you don't talk about the issue, and as you don't talk about the issue gains a certain prominence. It gets highlighted. So,